Thank you all for coming, and welcome to those online. And for those who are new to the Society, to the Royal Asiatic Society, I just want to give you a brief introduction first before handing over to my colleague to introduce our speaker tonight. I'm Susan Whitfield. I'm a council member here of the Royal Asiatic Society. I'm also a professor at the Sainsbury Institute for Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures in Norwich. And we're delighted to be working together also with the Courtauld Institute of Art. And we have a colleague, Dr. Poulan, here tonight from there, on this lecture series on Japanese studies, past, present, and future. And we'll shortly be putting the whole program online, but for those of you who are here in person, you can see there's a sheet with lectures through 25-26. On many, many aspects of Japanese studies. I should say, we often thought of as being very Indian-centric society because that's where we started. But I was just looking back through the archives because I'm writing a paper about women in the early Royal Asiatic Society history. And within the first few years, one of the publications, the translations that was made under the Oriental Translation Fund in the early 19th century was a translation of the Japanese annals. So we've been very much involved in Japan from the beginning, even though it hasn't necessarily been prominent in our programming. So we're delighted now to give its place back as prominence over the next 8 months or so, 9 months or so. So that's why we're doing this series of all aspects of Japanese studies. And as I said, it will shortly be available online. So we welcome you all to come. Just one more plug. Royal Asiatic Society is a charity, and we rely a lot on our members for being able to put on events like this freely for everyone to tell them more about studies of Asia and Asian studies. So please do consider joining. We can be a local member, but we also have student membership and overseas membership. So for any of you who aren't members, we very much hope to welcome you into the fold, which will enable us to do more events like this. Okay, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Simon Kaner of SysJac, to introduce our speaker tonight. So thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you very much indeed, Susan, and good evening, everybody. Well, I sound even more gravelly than I thought I did. It's a real pleasure to be here today. The photograph in the middle shows a group of students from the Courtauld Institute of Art at Muroji Temple in southern Nara. And Susan and I just happened to overlap with that group in May this year. And this lecture series kind of grows out of an interest from all three organisations. So on behalf of the Sainsbury Institute, which I'm representing, it's really wonderful that we've been able to pull it all together. And I just want to begin by saying a huge thank you to Susan Whitfield for all the heavy lifting that she's done, putting together a rather wonderful programme at remarkably short notice. So thank you, Susan, for doing all of that. So Japanese studies. So last week at the University of Cardiff, we had the 50th anniversary meetings of the British Association for Japanese Studies. And there were a lot of amazing scholars there. What I found particularly delightful was a lot of really young, enthusiastic new scholars bringing a sort of a breath of fresh air, I think, to the field, which is doing pretty well, I think we could say, in the UK. And it's a particular pleasure to have Professor Jennifer Coates kick off this year-long series for us, because Jennifer was elected as the new president of the British Association for Japanese Studies just last week. So thank you, Jennifer, for finding time in your busy schedule to come and do this for us. I got to know Jennifer when she was actually with us at the Sainsbury Institute in BC, before COVID times, and but we lost her to the wonders of the University of Sheffield shortly after that, and that is where Jennifer is currently Professor of Japanese Studies. Jennifer's published very widely, is a very distinguished scholar of Japanese film, and also has published very widely in Japanese gender studies. This evening is going to talk to us on studying Japan from the UK, new challenges and historical perspectives. So without further ado, Professor Jennifer Coates.
Thank you so much, Simon, and thanks to Susan and your colleagues as well for the kind invitation. As Simon said, Japanese studies in the UK is doing very well, in spite of some of the challenges that have been wished on us lately. But we wouldn't be doing half so well if it wasn't for the kind support of the various professional associations and the embassy, who regularly turn out and sort of shout on our behalf in the rooms that we don't necessarily get into. So we really appreciate opportunities like this to talk about the importance of Japanese studies in the UK. So this is kind of a generic title. I'm going to apologize for that right from the start, because I was invited to talk about studying Japan from the UK, and this is a really nice time to be talking about it, because this is obviously when our new students are just starting at the various Japan and East Asian studies programs across the UK. And of course, in the various departments that have Japanese expertise, even if they don't have Japan in the title. It's also kind of timely because unfortunately we are facing new challenges and ongoing challenges. You'll be very aware, I'm sure, of the campaigns at the University of Cardiff and the University of Sheffield to save not only Japanese studies, but in the case of the University of Sheffield, East Asian studies more broadly. And while Cardiff was successful in having their Japanese teaching protected, Sheffield is still struggling against some moves towards shrinking and reducing our offer as well as our staffing. So this is kind of a moment when I think it's really important to talk about not just what studying Japan in the UK can do for our students or for our staff, but also what it does in terms of contributing to life in the UK as a whole. And then I guess the last part of my talk, the historical precedents. I hope you're going to bear with me here. As Simon mentioned, I have just taken on the presidency of the British Association of Japanese Studies. Just this morning, the previous president sent me a fantastic detailed history of the 50 years of the association. So I'm sort of frantically trying to memorize that, because it seems like the kind of thing that a person in this role gets called on to talk about a lot. So apologies, I should say, for any errors in what's about to come, and they are all my own. They're definitely not Professor Peter Kornitsky's, although you are going to see his words quoted on quite a lot of these slides. So the basic premise for this talk was basically thinking about studying Japan from the UK in the current moment. And I'm sure it's not news to anyone here, particularly anybody who's watching the news this morning, that we are kind of in a moment where many countries around the world are turning inwards to prioritize national concerns and domestic politics. Whether that looks like America First, Nihon Fasto, or some of the movements happening here in the UK. At the same time, however, in universities that teach Japan, we can see that Japan remains an object of fascination for students. Students are still showing up to enroll in these programs. And of course, researchers are still undertaking their research. As I'm going to be discussing shortly, they're still winning awards and recognition for that research. And the general public regularly turns out to events that we organize that are related to Japan, as well as to things like the Japan Foundation's fantastic touring film festival, which they run in February. So it's kind of a strange moment where overall rhetoric seems to be focused on inward and national concerns, and at the same time, this kind of fascination with Japan continues. And again, many of you are probably familiar with sort of the origin stories of this fascination. Often early attempts to engage with or think about Japan were perhaps not engaging with Japan itself as we know the real country and group of people today, but rather kind of conjuring an imagined Japan which in a project I've been working on lately, I've been calling Japan outside Japan. And this version of Japan has been kind of imagined, visualized, discussed, and brought into being outside of Japan itself for centuries, maybe starting with the mystical Japan, which you might have spotted just west of the fictional country, Laputa, in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels in 1726. All the way through, I guess, coming closer to my field, to the first filmed images of Japan, which the cameramen from the Lumière brothers company captured and circulated in 1897. This is a shot of one of those short films known as Actualities of a street in Tokyo. And you can see we're hitting a lot of the kind of expected, I guess, imagistic tropes of Japan that might be held in Europe at this time, including, you know, people in rickshaws and people in kimono walking up and down the street. This might be a version of Japan outside of Japan that you saw on your latest visit to your local supermarket. You probably noticed that references to Japan, imagined and more concrete, and Japanese influence are appearing everywhere. I found this on my supermarket shelf in Waitrose a couple of months ago, a jar of umami, which I'm not quite sure. I feel like that's a little bit like selling a pot of, I don't know what you would call it, it's spicy or something like this. But yeah, this kind of reference to Japan, I think, is kind of proliferating through every aspect of our daily life at the moment. So one of the things that I want to start by thinking about a little bit is how the history of Japanese studies has shaped our ideas about Japan in the UK. You're probably aware that just around the corner, the School of Oriental or African Studies, SOAS, was founded in 1917, but until 1941, very few students took courses in Japanese. So as Susan was mentioning, the Oriental in the title there referred to other parts of the world, not specifically Japan or East Asia. By 1942, however, there was perceived to be an urgent need for Japanese linguists and code breakers. One of the points that we're currently making to university administrators at every opportunity is that you can't suddenly magic trained linguists out of nowhere. You do have to invest in language training programs and grow linguistic expertise. And I think 1942 is a really nice example of a kind of moment when that expertise was suddenly recognized to be needed. So between SOAS and the secret Bedford Japanese School, hundreds of men and women were trained to use Japanese for wartime service. And this is kind of where the study of Japanese and Japanese studies more broadly in the UK starts to boom. Supported at many points by the University Grants Committee, or the UGC, which published a series of reports thinking about how Japanese and other language provisions could be funded within the UK university systems as they themselves iterated and changed. So in 1947, the Scarborough Report led to the enhancement of Japanese studies at SOAS and the appointment of dedicated lecturers in Japanese at Oxford and Cambridge. A further report in 1961, the Hayter Report, recommended that research and teaching on Asia, Eastern Europe, and Africa be substantially expanded in recognition of changes that had taken place in the world since 1947. And so additional funding was provided for 10 years and new centres were established. One of those was the Centre for Japanese Studies at the University of Sheffield, which was founded in 1963. And the idea there was that in contrast to some of the research that was happening in SOAS, Oxford and Cambridge, Sheffield would focus very specifically on modern Japan. However, the Hayter funding came to an end in 1973, and from that point on, there was a gradual attrition of funds, which were no longer protected specifically for Japanese studies. You might be familiar with the Parker Report of 1986, which began to address that. Sir Peter Parker, who had learnt Japanese during the war and became chairman of British Rail, authored a report titled Speaking for the Future, a review of the requirements of diplomacy and commerce for Asian and African languages and area studies. And this made a really strong, partially business-focused case for funding for languages and cultural studies, or politics and social studies of these particular areas, including for Japanese studies. So this seemed like a moment where maybe the future of Japanese studies was becoming a little bit more secure, until 3 years later, when the UGC itself was disbanded and replaced by the University's Funding Council, which in turn was dissolved in 1992. So you can kind of see a pattern here where we not only have to convince government bodies and governments of the necessity of funding Japanese studies and other East Asian area studies, but we're also reliant on those funding bodies themselves as they change and as they are dissolved and reorganized. And this is a pattern that, as I mentioned, Professor Peter Krunitzky, who was the British Association for Japanese Studies president from 2022 until 2025, terms depressingly familiar. He says, 3 times since the end of the Second World War, the study of languages and societies beyond Europe has been seen as a priority and funded accordingly. And 3 times, those funds have gradually disappeared in what became a depressingly familiar pattern. But it's not all depressing, because we do have some really grounded, fantastically developed, and while not always well-resourced, definitely extremely flexible, I think, and innovative studies of centers for Japanese studies around the country now. Despite fluctuations in funding, Japanese studies were then established anew in the 80s at several universities and expanded at others, this time in response to student demand. Funding for these new posts came from benefactions or from the Japan Foundation, the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation, and other bodies. And the result now is that more students than ever before are being exposed to Japanese and the study of Japan. And you can see these established centers here and those expanded centers sort of continuing to grow at the bottom there. So in the 1950s and 60s then, Japanese studies was mostly tucked away in small departments and tended to focus on languages and literature. With the inauguration of the Centre for Japanese Studies at Sheffield, important changes took place in the field, and political scientists, social scientists, economists, and historians working on Japan were now based in Japanese studies departments as often as they were based in their disciplinary homes. And even now in 2025, in some universities, that is still the case. Nevertheless, over the last 50 years, specialists working on Japan have continued to provide what Peter calls an essential counterweight to the dominant Eurocentric narratives in many disciplines. And I think this is where we don't only want to look to established and named centers of Japanese studies or Japanese studies departments, at the risk of missing all the fantastic work that's being done in other departments, other named kind of disciplinary areas, where Japanese specialists are often slightly holding colleagues to account when it comes to maybe totalizing claims or scholarship that seeks to be maybe slightly more general than it has quite the resource to be. So I think, Japanese studies is valuable in so many ways. And one of those ways is not just why study Japan, it's why not have a voice from somewhere else when you're testing any kind of claim about anything. So the British Association for Japanese Studies has also been an important pillar, if I'm allowed to say that. I wrote these slides before I became the president, so now it kind of feels a little bit like I'm just praising my own institution. But I think it is an important part of the history of Japanese studies in the UK. The British Association for Japanese Studies was founded in 1973, as Simon mentioned, to promote the study of Japan. And it also developed a journal, which was at first a kind of in-house community of scholars kind of publication, and is now one of the top Japanese studies journals in the world, Japan Forum, which has an international presence. And until recently, I think it's just being handed over to Edinburgh, but it's been very ably managed by colleagues at University of East Anglia, who've been doing a fantastic job, actually expanding it from 4 issues a year to 5. So it's, again, continuing to grow both in volume and in international recognition. The British Association of Japanese Studies is also really crucial to providing financial support to postgraduate students. I'm not sure if we have any postgraduate students online, but I do just want to remind you that it's always worth becoming a member of Badges if you are, because there are a number of ways in which we can support you to attend conferences and also to finish that tricky part of writing up your thesis. If you had funding and it's come to an end, or if your thesis writing is taking you into financial difficulties, we have the John Crump studentship that we can use to help support you get to the end of that very important task. We've also been very, very grateful for important levels of support from the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation again, and from the Japan Foundation, as well as the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation, the Toshiba International Foundation, and the Japan Foundation Endowment Committee, which again, PhD students and your supervisors, another great place to apply to, particularly if you need to do some research travel to Japan. I think possibly one of the largest sort of single contributors and the contributor who has made the most difference perhaps to individual students over the course of Japanese studies in the UK has been the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation. The GBSF studentships often make the difference between students who would not be able to study for a PhD at all, such as the extent of their funding. So we're extremely grateful to their contribution. And over the last 10 years, 127 PhD students have received funding for 1 or more years, amounting to a total of 2.5 million. So we really are doing our best to grow our own future of Japanese studies. And we couldn't do it without the support of all of these fantastic funding bodies. The Japan Foundation not only provides fantastic funding, they also kind of survey the state of Japanese studies around the world. And in the UK, they do this every 5 years. So we're actually just waiting for the results of the 2025 survey. Again, if there's anyone involved in Japanese studies, either in the room or online, who has not yet completed their survey, please do. It's really important because they make a lot of strategic decisions, not only about funding, but also about events and different things that they do to support us based on their picture of where we are across UK universities. So if that's sitting in your inbox, please fill it in, I think by the 12th of September. That's their deadline. So I'm going to be reporting slightly sort of outdated picture to you, but I think it's still useful. And maybe when the results are published in a month or so, you can kind of compare. As of 2020, we had 10 universities offering single honours Japanese studies courses, 4 that were offering joint honours, 35 universities with staff conducting research on Japan, and 12 universities which offered courses in Japanese language and/or translation studies alongside of other topics. We had more than 1,500 students studying single or joint degrees in Japanese as undergraduates, and we had 100 master's level students and 80 PhD students. So I think you can see that's quite like a healthy pipeline for the future of Japanese studies. Students actually often ask what they can do with a degree in Japanese studies, and while a lot of the material that we sort of produce to answer that question is targeted towards recruitment, I think it also tells us something quite interesting about Japanese studies in the UK, and particularly the contribution that it makes to everyday life. So student destinations after graduation are really wide-ranging, often involving the knowledge of Japanese, but sometimes not. And popular options are media and finance, but also law, publishing, business management, or civil service. One of the things we often hear from employers who are seeking to recruit students who have studied an East Asian language is that finishing a Japanese studies or a Chinese studies or a Korean studies degree shows that you can do something really hard, that you can be taught a new thing in a short amount of time and you can excel at it, and also that you're not afraid. So I think whether you plan to work in Japan or whether you plan to use Japanese in your work, it's still a really valuable thing to do. Many students have gone on to postgraduate work, where they're joined by a number of international students. And of those who complete PhDs, several dozen now also hold teaching positions related to Japanese studies in the UK or elsewhere. And there are many graduates also in university librarianship, museums, or fulfilling other roles that make use of their knowledge of Japanese. So I think, you know, we're well trained, we're well funded, and we're well positioned around the UK to make a contribution with what we've learned. And we hope that's going to continue to be the case. Japanese studies researchers, I think, also really punch, you know, above their weight in terms of, you know, the size that we are relative to many other areas of research in the UK. There are 5 UK academics in the British Academy who specialise in Japanese studies. And many have also received honours from the Emperor of Japan, including a number of those here today. UK-based academics in Japanese studies have also received prestigious British awards. And the one that we often kind of point to, because it's a little bit rarer, is the Philip Leverhulme Prize. I feel a bit rude drawing attention to this because I was one of the awardees in 2021, but this is kind of what I was thinking about using to pivot to talk to you, not just about Japanese studies in the UK and the history and challenges that we face, but also kind of emerging research in Japan. So if you'll bear with me for a little bit of, I guess, self-promotion, I wanted to talk to you briefly about my own project that I am just kind of finishing up after 3 years of funding from the Philip Leverhulme Prize. And this is the project that I mentioned before called Japan Outside Japan. So the project started out asking, who are the people who communicate and shape ideas about Japan? Going all the way back to Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels, I was kind of thinking, how do we imagine Japan today, and who sort of influences that imaginary? You can also tell this was a very COVID project because it was all about imagining somewhere from somewhere else when we weren't able to travel for research. And since then, I've been able to top up my desk-based research with a number of visits to Japan and interviews with people who take on this kind of role. But I'm basically interested in exploring the role of public persona, or personalities in the public sphere, who are part of creating ideas about an imagined Japan. And I focused at first on kind of creators and celebrities, because I'm thinking of these people as sort of culture brokers, people who introduce ideas about Japan to general audiences. And so, for example, when we are speaking to students or trying to recruit to our Japanese programs, people do often mention, you know, Marie Kondo and her secret magic of tidying up as sort of a Japanese influence that they're already aware of. Not so much the students, I'm going to be honest, more their dads will have watched James May, cameramen in Japan. But, you know, these are kind of some of the reference points that people in the UK are coming to Japanese studies with. My own background, as Simon mentioned, is film studies. And so at the start of this book project, I was trying to think a little bit about sort of how to get from Gulliver's Travels in 1926 to, I guess, James May on Amazon in 2020. And I was thinking about cinema culture as kind of a pivot point. Because cinema culture has really influenced, I think, in a very strong way, how Japan is imagined outside Japan, ever since the Lumière company cameramen, who I mentioned, brought their apparatus to Japan and started filming actualities. And I'm not sure how many people know sort of the other part of this story. We focus quite a lot on the Lumière brothers and their fantastic invention, the cinematograph. But one of the things that people, or the story that people don't know quite so well, is how that cinematograph got to Japan. Because Thomas Edison was actually there already before the Lumière cameramen, showing the Vitascope, which I think was the one where you kind of look like this, in Kobe. And so Japanese people were already engaging with the idea of cinema apparatus. However, the Lumière brothers had kind of a secret weapon, and that was their old school friend, Inabata Katsutaro, who had studied together with them in Lyon in a technical college or an engineering college, and had then moved back to Kyoto to take over his family business and become a really successful businessman. And so he was the one that wrote to his his old school friends and said, oh, you know, Japanese people are becoming quite interested in this idea of cinema apparatus. And I'm hearing you've got this great cinematograph. And do you want to see if you can bring it to Japan? And I could broker it. I can set it up for you. I can find you venues. I can, you know, get audiences together for you. And the Lumière company were really interested in this because one of the ways that they were making a lot of their money back home in France was showing images of other parts of the world where everyday people couldn't travel, and, you know, kind of saying, oh, this is what the rest of the world looks like. So the cameramen came with basically a list of things that they were supposed to kind of capture in these actualities, including geisha. They wanted kabuki actors, they wanted swordsmen, they wanted rickshaw drivers, very kind of stereotypical idea of Japan in Europe in 1897. And Inabata said, okay, well, you know, this is fine, but we're not having just this like play acting version of Japan exported to France, you know, kind of shaping the idea of how the country is today. You're also going to come to my house. So this is Inabata Katsutaro there, play acting a tea party for the Lumière cameramen, because he also wanted to kind of show this is how, you know, civilized Japan is, and these are our manners and our customs, and this is what we do. And I think on the one hand, it's kind of interesting that this short actuality called Family Meal is included in this broader kind of body of work that is very geisha and swordsman and rickshaw heavy. But more than that, I'm kind of interested in Inabata as a culture broker, someone who says, okay, well, you've told me what your idea of Japan is, and I can help you facilitate that to a degree, but I'm also going to push my image of Japan. And it's worth noting as well that Inabata, although of course he's Japanese, his image of Japan is still an image, right? Because if you watch this short film, it's only about 90 seconds long. There are a number of things in it that don't quite add up, that don't really make sense, including when this housemaid who's delivering some of the food places everything down, and Inabata does a big exaggerated bow to the housemaid, which a lot of people in Japan sort of pointed out as like, oh, this isn't really a very believable interaction. So we're still staging Japan here. This is still an idea of Japan, but it's an idea of Japan by a very international Japanese businessman who has a certain vision that he wants to put across. So I was kind of interested then in the idea that from its earliest arrival in Japan, cinema technology was very quickly understood, both by businessmen, also by governments, as a persuasive medium of communication that was capable of reaching large audiences, including audiences overseas. And so I thought maybe cinema would be a good starting point for an investigation into how these impressions of Japan are formed and who plays key roles in creating and sharing those impressions. I started kind of looking into Sight and Sound magazine, which I'm assuming there are probably we have definitely readers and fans and probably contributors to Sight and Sound in the audience. For those of you not familiar, this is the magazine that's affiliated with the British Film Institute, and it's the UK's longest running cinema publication. So I thought this would be kind of a good way to get a bit of a view on how Japanese cinema has been discussed over its long history. I also happen to have a whole pile of Sight and Sound in my office. Actually, first of all, in my office at the Sainsbury Institute, Simon, I'm sorry, that was what was on the floor in the boxes. And I brought it with me to Sheffield. And then, as I said, you know, we were almost immediately in the pandemic and it was very hard to go anywhere. And I think we were all starting to kind of try and use what was just lying around in our offices to move our research on a little bit. But one of the reasons I was so reluctant to get rid of this, even though these are now digitized as well, is that they were actually given to me by Heidi Potter when she was clearing out her office. You can see her here receiving the Order of the Rising Sun Gold and Silver Rays. And at the time, she was the chief executive of the Japan Society as well. And I thought this was kind of interesting. The Japan Society is a key institution in the Japanese culture industry in the UK. So the fact that she has had this stash of Sight and Sound in her office the whole time she's been shepherding the Japan Society kind of suggests a bit of a a connection there between you know, the journal and those who bring Japanese culture to UK audiences. So I thought, okay, let's start here. And one of the things that you might be aware of in film studies is that the common story of how Japanese film comes to Europe and the Anglophone West is with Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon at Venice in 1950. So I was kind of thinking I'm probably not going to find anything about Japanese cinema in Sight and Sound before 1950. You know, I might as well start there. But I had this actually quite adorable set of digitized, very early Sight and Sound articles, and they're so aesthetic. I sort of couldn't help picking them up and rummaging around with them. And I thought, what happens if I just search for Japan and I just see, you know, what's the first moment Japan comes up? Like, let's think about that. So I started, I guess, like delving into the early history of Sight and Sound, which might not seem like it's got much to do with Japanese studies. And I learned a lot that I didn't actually already know about the magazine. I'd never really thought about the history of Sight and Sound. It was published by the British Institute of Adult Education until 1934. Then it was handed over to the British Film Institute. And then it was merged with the British Film Institute's monthly film bulletin in the 1990s and became a monthly publication. So this is kind of how it established itself. Not somewhere I'd ever really thought to look for anything more than, you know, interviews with Hamaguchi Ryusuke when a new film comes out or when he wins the Oscar for Drive My Car or something like this. The first mention of Japan in Sight and Sound is actually in volume 1, number 1, which I also didn't know was published in 1932 because the British Film Institute was established in 1933. I had always thought that Sight and Sound was the British Film Institute's journal, but actually Sight and Sound argues for the foundation of the British Film Institute. So volume 1, number 1 is basically given over to making the case for the construction, the establishment of the British Film Institute. The British Film Institute itself was then founded in 1933, and it has changed and moved and sort of expanded and contracted, much like Japanese studies in the UK, actually, in the sort of almost 100 years since then. So it houses the British Film Library, previously the National Film Library, also the National Film Archive and the National Film and Television Archive as well. And it has moved since its original premises were bombed during World War II, and the post-war director of the Institute took that move as an occasion to petition the government to build a new space, which is the one that we know today, first as the National Film Theatre and now renamed as the British Film Institute since 2007. This was like a very quick history of the BFI that I had to familiarise myself with after realising that volume 1, number 1, features the first of many frequent mentions of Japan in Sight and Sound. And this shows up in an article. You probably can't see the very small print there, but I have some larger screenshots coming up where you can see a little bit more. This was an open letter that was authored by the Honourable Secretary of the Commission on Educational and Cultural Films, A.C. Cameron. And he said, you know, in Japan, government and voluntary associations are working together to use this powerful medium in the best interests of the state in an article that sought to anticipate the report of the Commission on Educational and Cultural Films by arguing for the creation of a British Film Institute. So this is, you can see a little bit more clearly here. You know, so he's kind of telling this slightly stereotypical story of Japan, I think, that we have all heard. You know, Japan came effectively into contact with European culture within living memory and accepted it selectively. Note the gendering also of Japan as she. She did not reject the film, but government and voluntary organizations are working together to use a powerful medium in the best interests of the state. So this seems like a really, I don't want to say like throwback way of talking about Japan, but, you know, this is a kind of dated way of talking Japan. You know, she has been out of contact with European culture. But actually, if you kind of read between the lines a little bit, this is an argument that we are very familiar with and that we hear, I'm going to say almost every year from governments and from think tanks. Japan is getting ahead of you. Don't fall behind. We need the infrastructure that Japan has. We need the innovation that Japan has. Otherwise, we'll be catching up. We'll be the ones that are kind of locked out of dominant culture. So this, what I'm calling a surprisingly Japanese history of the BFI, was a bit of a strange find and not something I would have thought about if it were not for Heidi and her lovely donation of her back catalogues of sight and sound. I think it's also worth noting that the year that this was published was 1932. So the use to which the Japanese state was putting that powerful and persuasive medium of film was about to become very, very clear. And in fact, those are the dominoes that eventually fall towards creating a serious and seriously funded Japanese studies in the UK after the Second World War, when the government realizes, oh, we really need to know what's going on, not only in Japan, but also in Japanese. And I think this is, kind of an example of the discursive role that Japan often plays. In Cameron's argument, it's an early example of the kind of associations of Japan with forward-thinking media strategies, which continue to shape the discussion of the country and its filmmakers today. If you ended here, this would be a really nice, positive kind of story about, look how early we embraced Japan and Japanese culture in 1932. But I do think it's important to mention that there's another side to the story. So Japan comes up repeatedly all the way through these early issues of Sight and Sound. It's almost always in sort of bureaucratic and educational sort of capacities. So this is an example of an article from 1933 where an educator is arguing for the use of film in Scottish schools. And she says, in Japan, the School Film Circuit League show over 4,000 reels to schools, but in Scotland we have little progress. In England also progress has been slow. So again, it's kind of like, they're doing this in Japan, why can't we do it here? At the same time, and this is genuinely bizarre, Sight and Sound had a Japan correspondent, I guess, someone who in the early 30s was writing from Japan about going to the cinema. He didn't have very much to say about film content itself, although we did get a lot of these nice pictures. So again, for a discipline, film studies, in which the story we tell is we become aware of Japanese cinema in 1950, it's bizarre that this was in Sight and Sound sort of so regularly, and that this kind of Japanese cinema culture was something that UK readers were becoming so close to. At the same time, there is some signs of the sort of pejorative ways of discussing Japan, which were part of the image of Japan as somewhere that doesn't make high quality cinema, as somewhere that doesn't send high quality films to film festivals, for example. So the correspondent who went by the name E.K. Venables, whose accreditation was who has spent many years in the Far East, which I quite like, spent a lot of time describing kind of noisy and chaotic cinema experiences. He introduced readership of Sight and Sound already in 1933 to the idea of the benshi, the film narrator. And he talked a lot about audience behaviors, as well as kind of some content elements like long fight scenes. He had some really interesting thoughts on newsreel footage from Japan's Olympic Games and also from battlefields in China, which is quite sort of out there for Sight and Sound readership, I think. But you can see the kind of vignettes that he's sharing. He says, people clatter and shuffle in and out, past you, around you, over you. Local gentlemen loudly inhale the remnants of their last meal with the aid of a vigorously plied toothpick and emit the grunts and gurgles which form the customary sign of gastronomic appreciation. And he's kind of complaining about, people are snorting, they're breathing heavily. He can smell the toilets. He has this kind of zinger at the end of paragraph 1 where he says, this country will never be fully interpreted to the world's film-going public until they introduce the stinkies. Which is such a strange polarization, isn't it? In issue 1, volume 1, page 1, you have a member of the British government saying Japan is technologically ahead of us. We need to be doing what they're doing. And then, you know, just a year later, we have someone saying, oh, no one's ever going to understand Japanese cinema culture, and making a joke about toilets. He then kind of points out that the katsuben, or the benshi, the interpreter, he says foreigners call the interrupter, which I suppose you would if you didn't understand what he's saying, is the most important figure in Japanese film. And this is kind of the reason that he gives for Japanese film being sort of, as he puts it elsewhere, untranslatable. And this is also a myth that really had a very, very long tail in film studies. So one of the reasons that's often given for Japanese cinema sort of taking until 1950 to break onto the European and North American kind of cultural circuits is the idea that the benshi was such a central part of Japanese film culture that films were almost made around them, and so not intelligible to people who didn't have an interpreter or a benshi type figure in their film culture. And I think the other thing that I find so interesting in this account is that E.K. Venables also says that when he goes to watch a non-Japanese film in Japan, the native speakers, furious at someone understanding anything that they could not, yelled at us for making so much noise. And I feel like this just completely encapsulates this double standard. You know, earlier in the piece, he's complaining that it's the Japanese viewers who make noise, but then there's something that he wants to see, that he can understand, and he goes and he's complaining, I'm being yelled at for making too much noise. So there's this kind of interesting flipping throughout the piece where on the one hand, Japanese film culture is portrayed as extremely alien and extremely, you know, not of British readership or British film audiences kind of imaginary. And then at the same time, the writer depicts himself engaging in exactly the same behaviors that he has just complained about Japanese audiences engaging in. So yeah, as I mentioned, this kind of narrative of Japan and Japanese film culture was often used to explain why Japanese film did not do well outside of Japan. So Venables argues, you may find it almost hard to believe this plain account of things that we're accustomed to seeing, but it may help you to understand a little why Japanese films, like many other aspects of Japanese life, are at present somewhat beyond worldwide appreciation. Nonetheless, Japan's film culture was a notable part of the case for the creation of British National Film Institute. And so I'm still kind of working out what I'm doing with this. I'm sort of moving this around a little bit in the book, trying to figure out where its place is, because I think this is like a small story about a British cultural institution that also perfectly encapsulates the push-pull kind of attraction-repulsion, which Edward Said talked about as a core element of his theory of Orientalism, but which I think we can also see in British government and institutional approaches to thinking about why study Japan and why fund the study of Japan. Is it of us? Is it internal? Or is it completely alien? Is it the people yelling in the cinema theatre that we don't understand? Or is it the people yelling at us for yelling in the cinema theatre and we're behaving the same? This insider-outsider, close and far kind of polarization is just constantly switching, I think, in the story of UK engagement with Japan. And so in closing, I thought I would borrow the title of a book that's actually slightly about something else. This is actually a book about immigration to Japan. But I thought the title, No Island is an Island, is such a perfect encapsulation of the UK-Japan relationship. Because they're two countries that in many ways could not be further apart, almost, could not be more different in so many aspects of history and culture. And yet studying Japan from the UK is also always studying the history of the UK itself. I didn't know how the British Film Institute got founded. I didn't know the relationship between Sight and Sound and the British Film Institute. And I've been a film scholar studying in the UK for longer than I should probably admit. It was the study of Japan that crystallized that investigation for me. And if I hadn't thought about looking at film culture in the UK through the lens of Japan, I don't think I would have come to that. So I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you for your patience. I'm sure people have lots of questions, so I'll hand over to you.
Jennifer, thank you so much. That was fabulous. I've got a new concept now, the stinkies.
Thank you.
It makes me think of contemporary cinema, where it seems that you now go to enjoy a hot meal and all sorts of things happening in the auditorium. But
honestly, Salvador Dali tried to invent it, but it wasn't popular. He did a really good sketch, but he could never actually make it work. But yeah, there's a prototype.
So all these films that were being made in the 1930s, were any of them available for viewing outside Japan? Or was that 1950s moment when Kurosawa's Rashomon, was that the first Japanese language film to make an impact? If I could get you to something else.
Rashomon was the first film to win prizes and international reviews on the International Film Festival circuit. So it's as much a story, I think, about the success of the Venice Film Festival as it is about the success of Japanese film. There must have been available Japanese-made films circulating outside of Japan. But the question is whether they make sort of column inches or archival notation to the point where you actually understand where they are. On your own doorstep, you probably remember, there's a really great and unexpected archive of amateur Japanese films, I think from 1933 to 1937 in the television archive in East Anglia, which one of our colleagues, Noriko Morisue, found when she was visiting. And those apparently came to the UK as part of a competition for amateur filmmakers. Again, really fascinating. You know, these are sort of images of everyday people's view of Japan in 1937. So at a point when, again, that's a country that's turning quite inward. You know, everyday people are walking around capturing their daily life and sending it to East Anglia to be judged in this film competition. So I think basically you need an infrastructure often for these things to circulate and be archived. But they must have been around, I think.
Thank you. For those of you online, I believe there is a facility for you to type in your questions and a voice will voice those questions for us. But while you're busily tapping away, do we have any questions in the room?
I'll also take corrections if that's what you...
I'd like to make a comment about it. Online. In the 1930s, films, some of you may be aware of the 1930s films made by the Kokusai Bunka Shinkokai. I have restored all of them and from original 16mm prints. And they were made by the Japanese government. It's a semi-governmental organization which predated the Japan Foundation. And they are, the purpose of those was to promote trade and interest in Japan and interest in Japanism. So those films, there are 13 or 14 or 15 of those films, and I have restored all of them. Or well, not all of them. I have made new versions of some, and others I have restored for the Japan Foundation. I found them in the Japan Foundation in the late 70s, rotting, and I have rescued them. So that's something else that, you know, if you think about films from the 1930s, they were distributed all over Europe and America because the titles are in English, and they also made them in German and Chinese and Italian, I gather, with titles. But I think they all got destroyed after the war because, you know, after Japan lost the war, most of the documentation was just thrown out or burned. So those films do exist.
That's such a good point, isn't it? Because not to get to film studies about it, but it almost comes down to the question of like what counts as a film, right? And it does make you think, I think one of the reasons that, you know, the Kurosawa Rashomon Venice story is so popular is because that fits the auteur filmmaker model that at that moment, Europe and North America considered like the dominant mode of artistic filmmaking. Whereas actually a lot of what is circulating are actualities, shots of everyday life, government made, you know, trade, tourist imagery, you know, the kind of the ephemera of everyday life on film rather than Mm,
that film. Right.
mm, mm,
That's
mm,
right.
mm, mm, mm.
That was so interesting. But can I just ask you whether in your project you looked at the pre-cinematic photographic image? Because for 3 decades or more, images which were used to replicate an image of Japan have been produced quite extensively.
No, I'm not actually. I'm struggling to draw parameters around the project because I think this is one of the challenges, isn't it? If you go back to Gulliver, if you're starting at Gulliver's Travels, that is a lot of history of imagining Japan, right? So to be honest, and I hope Heidi is going to be okay with that. The idea of using sight and sound, because Heidi Potter had given it to me, started me thinking about maybe drawing a parameter around the study by using archives that were given to me by collectors related to Japan and Japanese imagery. So at the moment, each chapter begins from a gifted archive from someone involved with Japan. But yeah, it's not going to be exhaustive by any means. So I'm hopeful that it might be the kind of thing where other people, start chipping in all the bits that I've missed. But yeah, that would be a really rich study.
Can I take you back to the earlier part of your talk? And it's great to hear that we think Japanese studies is doing well, despite headwinds. But do you have a sense of how Japanese studies fits in a broader picture of interest in, or lack of it, in learning foreign languages as a whole in the UK, and what might be termed area studies, I suppose? Do you think that that whole sector is in good health, are we talking enough to people in those other language groups and language areas?
That's such a good question, isn't it? Because again, I think it's maybe a little bit of a similar story in that individuals are doing great work, and the UK Association of Area Studies does great work, I think, bringing us all together to talk about issues that cross-cut, from Canadian studies to Korean studies. I mean, I think we are facing a moment. Universities have definitely let it be known that they consider language teaching to be expensive. And that's always been a challenge, I think, especially as, tuition fees and expenditure within universities have sort of detached and fluctuated. I think the trouble right now is that nobody really knows what the impact of generative AI is going to be, right? And one of the things that troubles me is that we don't see representation of area studies, and especially area studies grounded in language learning in those decision-making rooms where people are trying to figure out what do universities teach in a world where students or would-be students have access to generative AI, especially where that is translating for you. And I think those of us who've spent some time on language learning and area studies know that translation is not input-output without the cultural context. You're always going to have big and bad mistakes, right? Do the people in the decision-making rooms necessarily have that experience? Unfortunately, I'm not sure that they always do. I think partly because, also it takes time to learn a language, and this is why everybody wants a shortcut, but it also means that to produce the kind of work that we want to do that's grounded and considered, it is taking time, and that means that maybe researchers from our community are less likely to pop up in the managerial decision-making roles in the university. But that's an emerging picture. I don't have the answer for that today. Sorry, I'll think about it.
Thank you. So we've got
feelings about AI.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe in the front.
Sorry, just to add to that, because I recently was basically giving a presentation to anthropologists, telling them off for not learning enough languages because they don't, which I think is strange given the claims anthropology makes. Anyway, it really, the drop in languages enrollments and this kind of issue actually traces back to the removal of modern languages as a compulsory part of secondary education. And it's really interesting when you look comparatively across contexts. So in Australia as well, for example, Australia, where I grew up, we learnt Japanese or Chinese or Indonesian in high school in the 90s because it made sense and there was wealthy funding for it and stuff like that. When they removed that, you started to see East Asian languages interest drop again in university enrollments. And I think it's about basically planting the seed of forcing young people at a certain point to do something uncomfortable so that they then think it's that it's possible. Yeah.
It's frustrating, isn't it? Because going back to the point about recruiters actively seeking out people who've learned East Asian languages because they're difficult, and that proves that they can learn complex coding languages or whatever is required for finance. I don't pretend to understand. But yeah, that very difficulty is part of the selling point. But yeah, how much difficulty is too difficult or too much difficulty at the point of recruitment?
Thank you so much for this beautiful talk. It was such a glorious arch sort of from the past towards the present. And I think hinting into the future in the question time. And so what I'm hoping to ask you, especially because you talked about images and imaginaries, is a question you can take either way. It's about the future, but whether it's about a kind of future imaginaries in these past depictions, or whether you have sort of a sense of the kind of imaginary of a future that you would like to see. If you were to chart a vision for us.
Such a nice question, such an anthropological question about imaginary. I think I've sort of two small side projects involving imaginaries and imagination right now. One is looking at the idea of what in media studies is called future imagineering, which is basically the idea that sort of like media and art can envision things that we can then create and put into practice that we wouldn't have thought about if it hadn't been first visualized in media and art. And the example is always, you know, Star Trek invented the iPad theory, that you see it first on screen and then somebody starts thinking, oh, how do I make that? And then the other sort of small project is actually about smart homes in horror films and sort of the legacy of Japan as futuristic, but in a scary sort of way that is tied into sort of ideas about Japanese aesthetics as minimalistic to the point of controlling. So I'm kind of thinking a little bit about where trying to bring imaginaries into concrete reality involves sort of responsibility for the future that you're making, right? And I think that that has a lot to do with the tendency towards stereotyping and recirculating of stereotypes. I think that, you know, there are so many stereotypes of Japan that are coherent in one way, and then there's another basket of stereotypes that do not cohere with those. So to go back, I think, to the BFI example, you know, the stereotype of sort of Japanese films as completely unapproachable, no idea what's going on here, Japanese audience behaviors as just what is going on, and then the account of the British audiences doing exactly the same thing and not recognizing it. I guess one of the things that I'm wondering about is we've had centuries of this idea of Japan is the future, but it's also scary, but it's also backwards, but it's the future, but it's also scary, but it's also backwards. Like, how do you break that cycle and think, you know, what would Japan as the future for good or, you know, for sort of productive or for happiness actually look like? And I think that the answer is something to do with acknowledging like that all was already imbricated history. Like, Japan is the future. There's also nothing Japan's doing that we're not already doing ourselves, even if we call it something else, right? So I think it's maybe looking for like the points of sharedness amongst the difference and what that tells you about how you want your particular place to be. Very fuzzy. The big imaginary cloud.
Gentlemen, come back.
Very much so. Now, I had the experience of school teaching in the 90s, where there was a Japanese, it flickered a number of, and then died down. And because of the reason given was the sort of rise of Chinese. And, but I just wondered if that was a very unusual experience in the school. But what I noticed was that the arguments that you heard against it didn't seem to fit. Although cost was important, I think the switch to comprehensive education, it somehow didn't fit the sort of rationalization of the curriculum and the idea that languages were now a specialized thing in certain schools. Like just as science, to do all the three sciences. Do you know that sort of? It was an interesting, curious, but I don't know. It certainly attracted some unexpected people who did extremely well at it. It was a great shame it went. I wondered if the school was very unusual in that respect.
I mean, we do still have a number of schools in the UK that are teaching Japanese. A lot of them actually come to SOAS for the Japan Foundation's 6th Forum Day, and that's always a really good snapshot of where people are teaching Japanese. There seems to be quite a lot of concentration in London and in the southeast. So I think that's also an interesting thing to think about sort of geographically, whereas interest in Japan or knowledge about Japan concentrated. But I also just love your example of like, oh, we stopped learning Japanese because China's the new thing and we're going to learn Chinese now. Like it's either or, like China and Japan are not also just as imbricated and more as, British history and Japanese history, right? Yeah, and it's so...
And there would be tremendous opportunities for prisoners. They have to be able to speak the language. Then they suddenly saw that the Japanese tide possibly heading a little, and that China was. It's a bizarre way of looking at it.
Yeah, and universities do the same, right? I mean, we were told just a few years ago, like, oh, Japanese studies is over because young people like K-pop, and now everybody wants to know about Korea. And again, yes, the numbers in Korean studies grew, but that actually didn't significantly take away from Japanese studies. And often the students themselves go between, learning about both and learning about China. So again, yeah, this idea that, there can only be one is a very bizarre, we can only have one East Asia partner, so we have to choose which. Kind of an odd contradiction.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody. There was lots of discussion. I think will continue over a glass of something, but we need to let our audiences at home go and have their suppers. And but just before we do that, I think I'd like to ask you to join with me in thanking Jennifer for a wonderful kickoff for our new series. Thank you very much. And just to say, this is a series, and what we're doing is we're hopping around between the 3 collaborating institutions. And on Thursday, the 18th of September, live from Norwich, we have Dr. Eriko Tomizawa-Kei, who will be talking about tradition reimagined, Okinawan art and koge in the 21st century. And this is an advanced preview, I suppose, of an exhibition that will be coming to Norwich at the end of October. So I very much hope that you'll be able to join us. You can join us online, and in fact, you can join us in person as well in Norwich for that talk, if you're able to do that. But just leaves me to say thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. And once more, thank you very much indeed, Jennifer. Wonderful.
No, it's not. I reclaimed my previous. Yeah.